another episode of Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me, as always, is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing good, Jody.
All right.
What's up with you? You good?
I'm all right.
Good. All right is fair enough, so we'll take that.
All right. What are we talking about today?
Today we are dealing with multiband compression and or dynamic EQ.
Oh, yeah.
And something that can possibly seem a little bit mysterious, maybe, and when we should use it or what have you. So we're going to kind of see if we can untangle some of those concepts and the way that you and I may go about using it.
All right.
So is this something that you use a lot?
I wouldn't say a lot, especially not for dynamic EQ. Multiband compression, on the other hand, if I'm mastering something, chances are I'm using that. In an actual mix, it's a rarity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm kind of with you there. It is something that happens, but for me, it's not in every mix, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
But it is a pretty good tool to have in your tool chest. I think for me, it was a certain intimidation factor of dynamic EQ initially.
Oh, I figured you were about to say that about multiband compression, but you're saying it about dynamic EQ.
Well, I think that can go for that as well. It seems like multiband compression is it's still just a compressor, right? You're just using it at certain frequency bands. You're just narrowing it. And dynamic EQ can possibly seem like a little bit more intimidating to kind of wrap your head around, but it really isn't. I mean, it's functionality-wise and results-wise, it can be quite similar, I think, but we have two different tools to do a similar job, I suppose.
Sure.
Why would you use either one of these? You mentioned it while mastering, so maybe we'll start there. So when you're using a multiband compressor in your mastering, why do you do that?
Generally speaking, the reason why I would do it, whether it's mastering or in a mix, has more to do with areas of the mix. And as you mentioned, multiband compressors deal with certain frequency ranges. Some ranges in some mixes may get a little bit more out of hand than others. And
frequency-wise, obviously, you're talking about, yeah.
Yes. Now, the other thing that tends to happen is that with the way things work out frequency-wise, just in general, in a decent mix.
I wouldn't know anything about it. So this doesn't apply to me.
Right. The way it's broken down in terms of volume levels, most often you're going to have more volume in the low mids than you will in the high mids and the highs and the lows. The low mids are kind of the meat and potatoes of things in a way.
There's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of stuff there, and that generally has the most volume range in terms of pure volume. Lows, on the other hand, taper off from that. High mids taper off from that, and highs are even more tapered off. And it has more to do with how our hearing range happens, I think.
Sure.
Because if you turn the high EQ, which is usually a 7K and above, you start turning those up to the levels in terms of pure volume as you would do with low mids, you're going to have ears that are starting to bleed maybe. Because it's just going to tear the living bejesus out of them. Which is why there is ranges for multiband compressors and where you would actually compress certain signals. That works the same way, whether it's in a mix or it's in a master. Of course, with a master, you're doing it across everything. In a mix, you might have the option of doing it on an individual instrument or a bus or your whole mix.
Yeah, I think generally, at least me, but I think I'm not alone in this, but when I think about multiband compression, I think more of a mix as a whole, or at least a stem as a whole.
I would too, yes. More often
so
than not.
it's not less so, not always, but less so on an individual track basis. There's an example that I'm going to bring up later where that is an exception. So then when you're using a multiband compressor on, like you described, on a mix, what are you trying to do, or why are you doing that? Are you trying to even out the signal energy-wise? Is it a sculpting thing for you, or is it something else?
I'll go with your latter answer of sculpting. More often than not, I am not doing this on a mix or project where I've been the recording engineer.
Okay.
I would say that maybe happens one case out of 250 for me on something that I've recorded. In terms of something else that's brought to me, and I wasn't in control of the recording process, so to speak. I was not the recording engineer where I could rein in the way things were mic'd and what levels they were mic'd at and whatnot. Chances are there's going to be something that's out of whack that needs control. And it's usually due to recording in a less than ideal space without paying attention to mic placement and how that affects the signal.
So you're saying that it comes to fixing issues that might be in the mix overall,
yes,
as opposed to things being not necessarily pristinely recorded, but appropriately recorded, where there isn't perhaps a big buildup in whatever frequency range they have. And of course, this comes down to also the person that may have done the mix, right? Their listening environment, and also obviously stylistic differences, I think, as well, where it's like it can sound really, really exciting in a certain frequency, but you get that ear fatigue that you're talking about, you know, with all the excessive high end. So it's adjusting things there for you then. Obviously, this will be dependent on the situation, but how aggressive would you get with this? I mean, I know that the cheap answer is as aggressive as you have to be, but to have it sort of being a fixing thing, but still hopefully relatively transparent, so you don't get this massive pumping thing going on.
Well, that's part of the reason to use a multiband compressor, is to avoid the massive pumping if you don't want it.
Sure.
The idea, generally speaking, when you have a normal compressor that compresses across the board and you're not using some sort of high-pass filter to filter out the low end that's just going to bump up the volume or bump past the threshold before maybe something happens. And of course, then it compresses everything else and you get that quote-unquote pumping sound. With a multiband compressor, if you need to tame the low end and you don't really need to compress everything else, you can use a multiband compressor. With a multiband compressor, you can put it on the entire range and say, okay, I'm not compressing any of this other stuff, but I need to compress here. It makes it a little easier to do that. That's across a range, which something we should denote that there's a big difference there between the multiband compressor and the dynamic EQ. And while we've been talking multiband compressor here for the last few minutes, dynamic EQ, as you mentioned, might seem mysterious, but is very similar to a multiband compressor, but can be much more focused than the average multiband compressor can be.
Right. That's the way I tend to think about it, where it's like if I need something that is really precise, let's say that I have a bass track, and when the bass is hitting that A flat or whatever, right? It's like, it sticks out. Then you can target that a lot easier with a dynamic EQ as opposed to just a multiband compressor where you set it to, I mean, you can get pretty narrow, but it's not as precise.
Yes.
Right? As a dynamic EQ. And of course, you can get really, really precise for like Q values and things like that with the dynamic EQ. That's also when I would reach for a dynamic EQ. And I would probably venture to say that if I have these kind of issues, I will tend to use a dynamic EQ more than I would a multiband compressor.
Specifically in a mix environment, you're saying?
Right, yeah.
If you get to the mastering stage and you've got a pinpoint situation like you're talking about, sure, you could use a dynamic EQ to focus on that.
Right.
But then there's something else that's inherently wrong with the mix. If it's going to a mastering person and you've got an issue with your A flat, so to speak.
Right. Yeah, because then it's beyond that. Then they're, like you said, they're deeper issues. To me, just to kind of circle back a little bit more toward the multiband compressor, it for me is an overarching thing. It's like a stereo bus thing. if there happens to be something, and where it could be like you're just trying to tame the low end. And so let's say that you're having it trigger just 100 hertz and down maybe, right? And you get above a certain threshold when that kick or that sub or whatever is hitting really, really hard, you tame it a few dB perhaps, right? Something I'm going to press you on a little bit because I'm not sure, I think we kind of glossed over it, is that, but when you're using a multiband compressor, how much do you generally let it take off? I mean, are you going just for like a few dB, or are you letting it be more aggressive and have less taken out and maybe a faster release, that type of thing? Or how do you generally think about it?
I don't believe I've ever used a multiband compressor on an individual instrument.
Right.
Saying that, I'm not against doing that on an individual instrument if there's ranges that work for that situation. It's just such a rare occurrence on an individual instrument that I haven't thought about it as a multiband compression issue. On a bus, that's a different story.
Yeah.
When things start to build up, you can work on the concept of sculpting the EQ a bit more to help shave a little bit of issues in and out of it. You can also use the multiband compressor. Now, if it's a buildup of a certain frequency that sounds relatively pretty good and shouldn't be where you're taking it out of multiple instruments to get things to sit right, the multiband compressor there becomes the tool of reducing the volume of what's building up. And you can get a decent range to do that and leave pretty much everything else around. In that case, it really depends on how much of that frequency buildup or frequency loss needs to be made up. In a mastering situation, it is so slight on what I'm doing that it might be getting maybe 1 dB of compression in any given range.
Okay.
And in terms of the release, especially in a mastering situation, and I would also consider it within the confines of a mix as well, my release more often than not is based on a rhythmic value minus a millisecond.
A millisecond.
Yeah. Or two.
Right.
The idea there, if the song is driving in 16th notes, I'm going to figure out the tempo. I'm going to figure out the milliseconds for that tempo for 16th notes and then shave a millisecond or two off of that 16th note vibe. That way the compressor is done by the time the next 16th note hits.
Right.
So that it's not affecting the groove overall by shaving off the attack of the next 16th note, so to speak. If it's 8th notes, I set it to 8th notes. If it's triplets, I set it on triplets. I do that because I'm a slave to the groove is the best way to say it. And I don't want to destroy that.
Sure. Now, I would think for my application on that, I hear what you're saying, and I totally get what you're kind of going for. I guess my issue would be that if I'm thinking that it's going to be that fast, it's going to be too pronounced of an effect for me. So I might have it.
Well, you must be going way beyond 1 dB then.
Possibly. It depends, again, what the issue might be, right? So if I'm thinking like a 1 dB on every 16th note, it's like...
Well, but I'm not getting there. That's the max. Generally, it's either not touching it at all or it's catching something that's flying up just a little bit and maybe maxing out at 1 dB in that range.
Okay.
Just that range.
Yeah. But I think the bottom line here that we're kind of getting at, and I think we're in agreement with, even though how we get there might differ, is just an overall sculpting. Obviously, when you're dealing with a mix, and we should say, you hinted at it earlier, but if you have to do too much as you're at a mastering stage here, there's problems with a mix that you probably get a better result if you go back and take care of that before it ends up at the mastering again, right? Now, sometimes that's not possible because deadlines or whatever, and you do what you have to do. But
well, this is where when you're talking to your mastering engineer, you have good communication.
Yeah.
And you don't get butt hurt when the mastering engineer comes back and says, you've got a problem in this area, please fix before I master. Some people get butthurt about that. And if you're doing it all yourself, then you might actually end up being in a situation where you're fooling yourself on your capabilities.
Yeah. And I think we've all been there at one point where we think we're better than we are, perhaps. But if the mastering engineer says that to you, trust him, because chances are that he's got better ears than you. He probably has a better room than you.
One would hope.
And that person is doing this for a living, possibly, right? So take their advice. If you're like, yeah, Chris, you have a lot of buildup at 90 hertz, then you examine that. Okay, well, why is that? Is it that my monitoring system is not there? Is it my personal taste? Am my ears just not developed enough to hear that?
Right.
But then you're at least aware, and you can take that away from that. Always something to learn. But let's dive in a little bit more toward dynamic EQ, I think.
All right. What would you like to talk about when it comes to dynamic EQ then?
What's the case when you might use dynamic EQ as opposed to the overall sculpting? We kind of hinted at it already, but give an example of where you might reach for a dynamic EQ.
The most often case use that I have, you already mentioned, when there is a particular note to an instrument. You specifically mentioned A flat on the bass, but it could be a guitar. It could be a drum. It could be a vocal. It could be the bass. It could be a keyboard. And it could be a compounded issue, not only from the instrument itself, but the room that it's being recorded in, if it is a live instrument being mic'd. Generally speaking, if there is a frequency that suddenly jumps out more often than not, like I know that I have a nylon string guitar, and that guitar sounds really good in the key of A. But when you hit an A, that A really jumps out. So it needs to be tamed, despite the fact that the guitar is sounding really good. The volume of it and the resonation of the instrument really sings out on that note, which is great. But if it's jumping out above everything else, not so great. That's where a dynamic EQ comes into play and is able to tame a smaller range, a smaller frequency, because you really can dial it in to a frequency and then play around with the Q so it's not so big and wide that you can dial that back in and it sounds sweet in the spot, but not jumping out in volume.
Yeah, that's a little bit more of an immediate use, I think, as a tool compared to a multiband compression, because you can get so narrow with it.
Yes.
And what I suppose we should mention as well is, like, why would you not just put an EQ on it? Well, it's because then you'd affect the entire sound of the instrument or the track, right? So you only want it when it hits that specific note or whatever.
And when it goes above a certain threshold.
Sure. Yeah. So that it triggers and just kind of, it's like having an assistant that just go, okay, when he plays that A flat, turn it down a little bit and then come back up, you know?
I can't even imagine. That would be so frightening.
It would be, yeah.
You got to turn it down just as much every single time that note is hit. Okay. That's where having a DAW and automated EQs and compressors that can do multiband and dynamics like that, where you can set it at a threshold. That's the whole idea here. You are going past a certain threshold, whether it's the multiband compressor or the dynamic EQ. And when that threshold is breached, that's when it kicks in and does something.
Right. So it can be really, really transparent as opposed to instead of just your regular EQ and just kind of automating a curve there, right? Because that could work. It's a lot of work.
Have you done that?
I have tried to do it, yeah, in the past.
It's a pain in the ass.
It certainly is. It certainly is. And it never seems to work quite as well as I would have hoped when I've done it.
Sure, so, it's tough. It can be done. It's hard. And when done right, it's not necessarily as noticeable, but a dynamic EQ is so much easier.
Right. that's what I think it excels at, and you can get those sculpting frequencies. So like you said, it's that bass note, it's that guitar note. I mean, it could even be like when the singer hits a certain note, right? The way it interacts with whatever effects that you might have on there, it can get a little jarring. It's a great way to kind of pinpoint problems with a mix. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention as well when it comes to this could be done with a dynamic EQ as well, but we mentioned a multiband compressor on individual tracks.
Yes.
And me sort of being the resident metalhead here, right? I'd have to kind of mention Andy Sneap, who's known for the Andy Sneap trick, right? And what that really is on heavy guitars, if you're doing a lot of palm muting, which you tend to do in that kind of musical style, right? That low end can really, really build up and just create mud in your mix, right? But you still want that aggression when something is just ringing out, whatever. So the Andy Sneap trick, what that really is, he puts a multiband compressor on the guitar tracks and has just a band going in between like 1 and 300. 100, I should say, not 1 hertz. That would be very low, but 100 to 300 hertz, and kind of going for like a 5 or 6 dB reduction there. And obviously, if you're trying this at home with that, you have to adjust your threshold to taste, right? So you kind of get that. It's fast, and it's amazing how much it kind of cleans up that without losing a lot of the low end of the guitars that you generally want. That's one of those instances where I'm sure there are other cases as well, but where it's like, okay, multiband compression on a single track. You can definitely do that. Of course, you could get the similar result, or if not the same result, with the dynamic EQ as well. You just have to find that frequency and kind of get that out of the way. So,
do you have any favorite uses for multiband compression or dynamic EQ?
Well, the dynamic EQ would be for all the stuff that we've just mentioned, right? Fixing random notes. You could do this on, let's say, like overheads, almost like a de-esser type of thing. But then I tend to reach for a de-esser as opposed to trying to do it just like this. It would be if there's the bass is sitting really, really well in the mix, but that note is just kind of poking out when he does the bass line or whatever it happens to be.
Right.
So instead of reaching for like automation or something on that note, a dynamic EQ for me is the cure for that. Multiband compression, it could be one of the things on, like, let's say, not only just the overall mix, but I don't tend to do a whole lot of mastering. So I don't really do that. I'll leave that to the mastering engineer if I'm sculpting a mix.
For sure, yeah.
If I need to do it on the full mix, there are other things I need to fix first. So I try not to do that. It could be just taming if you're stacking a bunch of like keyboards and pads and things where the low end can get a little bit rumbly. So that might be one thing I might have on like a keyboard stem or my keyboard group where I might use it there just to stop that from getting out of control.
Sure.
So those are my favorite uses. What about you, though?
In a mix, I'm more likely to reach, as mentioned before, for the dynamic EQ. It's a rarity that I'm reaching for the multiband compressor.
Right.
Favorite uses, multiband compressor. I don't think I've ever done it on individual tracks, as I mentioned before. However, dynamic EQ on individual tracks, I have reached for and used in more than a few cases.
Sure.
For me, the favorite use of a multiband compressor is the first line of action in a mastering situation is where I would reach for that, which could be your tail end of your mix if you're doing it on your 2-bus and you're sending that to a mastering guy. Not how I work, but that's how I would do it.
Yeah. All right. Any favorite tools?
Yes. In terms of dynamic EQ, I have one.
All right.
It is the dynamic EQ from Isotope.
Turns out you really only need one. Yeah.
You really only need one. And that one is a highly effective one. That's the one I like. That's the one I use. In terms of multiband compression, the one that I really dig using is the Precision Multiband from Universal Audio. Part of the reason why is that it has 5 bands capable of being used, up to 5 bands, whereas most other multiband compressors are 4 bands at max.
Right.
So yeah, mine's the Precision Multiband Compressor from UA.
Yeah. Instead of being boring and saying the Ozone one as well, I'll go for the SSL X Dynamic EQ,
Okay.
which is another one that's a dynamic EQ that I've messed around with some. To pick a multiband compressor, I like the one in Logic, the multipressor.
Sure.
Should I need to use one? It's functional. It's not the sexiest to look at, but it works. So that's the one I reach for generally. But like I said, I don't do it a whole lot, but that works for me.
Word.
Yeah.
So final thoughts here going into
Sure.
this. If you have to use a multiband compressor, what's your final thought on that?
There might be problems with the mix to begin with.
Yeah.
And I would say the same thing for dynamic EQ. If you're using this on every track, chances are you're overdoing it, or something else is a symptom of something being wrong with the mix. I suppose this could be one of those techniques also that once you kind of wrap your head around it and like what it's doing, you start looking for cases to kind of use this everywhere. Where it's like, oh, that's cool. I'm going to use it on everything,
Yep.
where you probably don't need to. So
Right.
I would say that if you have to use a lot of these tools in excess and certainly on every mix, it might be the mix itself that is not as good as you might want to.
Word up. And with that, let's move on to our Friday finds. Chris, what have you got this week?
Well, I'm a sucker for like Scandinavian dramas and things like that on TV, and something that very much sounds the part is an instrument by Sonoscore called Nordic Spheres.
Okay.
So that's going to be my Friday find. It's a contact instrument, and it has that sort of icy cold, frosty kind of soundscapey kind of sound that I like. So that's my find this Friday.
Sweet.
What about you?
I'm going with something that many people will probably want to jump on fairly quick in case this doesn't continue to be in the situation that it is. That is Wave Alchemy's Magic 7. What makes this cool is it's a recreation of the M7 from Bricasti, which is an amazing reverb if you are unaware. Right now, it is currently free. And free is good, and Bricasti is better. So get it now.
Point taken.
While we've got your attention, we ask that you go to InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and sign up for our mailing list. You'll need to be on our email list in order to be eligible for any future giveaways, and we'll make sure you don't miss any future episodes of this amazing podcast. Send us an email at goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word dynamics, and you'll get something cool back in your inbox. If you have a topic or suggestion for Chris and I to explain in a future episode, contact us at the contact page and we'll put it into consideration for a future episode. With that, I'll say see you next week.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Talk to you later, Jody.